By the end of the 19th century, much of the southwest of Ireland had been opened up for rail traffic by the Great Southern and Western Railway. But it was something of a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it made towns and cities accessible from the most remote rural areas. On the other, it facilitated massive emigration from the western seaboard. Yet it was into the west that Ireland's next major rail link was aimed. Its ultimate destination, the capital city of Connaught.
It was an ambitious notion to forge a rail link between Dublin and Galway through Mullingar and the cattle-breeding pastures of the Midlands, across the River Shannon at Athlone, and on via Ballinasloe and Athenry to Galway city. And it was to prove a dramatic undertaking involving Acts of Parliament and bitter divisions, massive engineering projects, and a pioneering incorporation of the existing canal system with the iron road of the new railway mania. Buoyed by their success in pioneering the Great Southern network, the directors of the Great Southern and Western, and in particular the MP for Roscommon, Fitzstephen French, nurtured the intention of promoting a line to the west. But unknown to the main body of investors, a breakaway faction under the Quaker entrepreneur James Perry was already planning a new line to Athlone. When Perry's new company, the Great Western, announced its plan, there was uproar.
Board meetings called at very short notice, standing orders suspended, supporting directors notified and opposition directors kept in the dark about meetings, reversals of decisions and so on. But the end result of the whole thing was that the Great Southern and Western seemed to prevail. French's project seemed to prevail. The Great Southern and Western was a stronger line at this stage. It was already building than the Great Western. And Perry signed an agreement on behalf of the Great Western with French in 1845. He signed an agreement that the Great Western would not go beyond Mullingar, but would in fact veer northwestwards to Longford and Sligo, and that's how it got the name Midland Great Western.
The deal was that the Midland Company would be allowed to build a railway along the canal route, but they must undertake to retain the canal and to retain it as a going concern. So the only option open to them was to use Canal Bank. But the way canals had been constructed in the past, there was always quite a wide amount of land on either side owned by the company. So they really were given a very useful piece of land to build their railway. It was all nicely levelled. It was all there, owned by them. And the statistics of other railway companies proved that it was a very, very cheap option.
In June 1846, construction of the line began at Broadstone in North Dublin and forged inland along the towpath of the Royal Canal. However, what in theory had seemed such a good idea, in practice had significant disadvantages.
The canal was laid in a curving manner and the railway was laid on its bank, and so was a whole series of curves, which is okay for a canal, which is slow, but is not suitable for a railway line. When the engineer who was in charge of the project, Mr. Hemans, reached Hill of the Down, he decided that he had enough curves and wanted a straight line for the rest of the railway line to Mullingar. So he drew a straight line, and this took him through lots of marshy, boggy ground. And there was the big challenge facing him. Initially, he tried to dig out the bog and excavate it, but he quickly found that because it was nearly all water, it just filled in as quickly as he dug it out. So then he knew that the water taken from the bog, the drainage, increased the strength of the bog. As the water was taken from the peat, he decided very cleverly to lay his railway line on top of the peat. To do this, he lay a few layers of heather sods and lay his railway line on top of sleepers or timber baulks, 12 inches by 6 inches, up to 25 feet long, laid at right angles transversely to the railway, with other baulks of similar size, 12 by 6s, laid longitudinally in the same direction and under the rails. The rails were laid on top of these longitudinal timbers, a whole lot secured together by fang bolts. This gave a rigid frame to support his railway line. The railway inspecting officer was quite satisfied, passed the line open for traffic, and the first trains ran down to the Hill of Down in 1847.
Those first 50 miles of track to Mullingar opened up the town itself and the Midlands region generally. Not only to passenger traffic, but to goods traffic as well. Agricultural produce from the rich grasslands of counties Longford, Meath and Westmeath could now be transported quickly to the port of Dublin for shipment to Britain. The coming of the railway led to a boom in the Midlands livestock industry.
Cattle numbers in general increased steadily between, say, 1850 and the First World War. So did sheep numbers. And the bulk of the movement there came along the Midland Great Western Line. So there is undoubtedly a stimulus to trade, but it's a trade that already existed. And what it did was to, I suppose, sharpen it and expand it and enhance profits in the area. In a way, it makes Ireland perhaps rather more dependent on the livestock trade than it had been previously, because it improved the relative profitability of livestock compared with tillage. And in a way, that helped reduce employment overall. I mean, it's a curious thing to say, but because tillage was far more labour-intensive, you needed far more people for tillage than for livestock, it may actually have had a damaging effect to that extent on total employment.
And that at a time when any reduction in employment would be devastating. In Black 47, when the Midland Great Western was being built, the Great Famine was ravaging the western seaboard. In the West, it was not cattle, but people that were being exported.
The emigrants would have stayed at home only if there were jobs at home. The railways couldn't create those jobs directly. They could facilitate if there were other stimuli there. But in fact, they probably contributed as much to increased imports by making it cheaper to bring goods from England, consumer goods and so on, retail goods. And Ireland did commercialise increasingly after the railway came. But it commercialised as much on the basis of buying imports. You sent out the cattle, you earned the money, and you bought the imports. The cattle went out on the railways, the imports came in on the railways, but it didn't enhance to the needed extent the industrialisation of the country. And only that could keep the people at home.
I think the railways had an enormous social impact on the country. This period in the 1840s was a very difficult period in Irish history. We'd gone through a period in the 1820s and 1830s with partial potato famine. There was a lot of unemployment, there was a lot of destitution, and then working up to the actual Great Famine period. So there was a lot of unrest in the country.
The reduction in population led to uncertainty. Famine was severe west of the Shannon, and there were reports of widespread disturbances and mass emigration. Investors became nervous. Despite that, with the building of an imposing terminus at Broadstone, the directors of the Midland Great Western presented an image of unshakable confidence. They'd need every ounce of it in the conflict that was about to erupt again with the Great Southern. This time about which of the two companies would be the first to reach Athlone, the bridgehead into Connaught.
Whoever commanded Athlone was in a position either to command the West or to stop somebody else commanding the West. Athlone was almost a garrison town for these railway companies. If they had the line to Athlone, it made it much more difficult for anybody else to then use Athlone as a jumping-off point for further subsequent developments. So Athlone was almost a defensive outpost. It wasn't that there was massive traffic, say, between Mullingar and Athlone. I mean, there was a continuation of traffic, but having Mullingar to Athlone didn't transform the fortunes of the Midland Great Western. But in its view, it prevented French cutting in, or anybody else cutting in, and holding the aces for what might happen down the line.
The result of the ensuing political stoush was that Parliament gave the Midland Great Western permission to go to Athlone, and as compensation, the Great Southern was allowed plans to advance to Tullamore. But immediately there was yet another row over the canals. The Midland had already acquired the Royal Canal, which it had used as a route for its line to Mullingar and to ferry passengers between stations during construction. Now the Midland set out to buy the Grand Canal. But having seen what the Midland had done, the Great Southern had intended to buy the Grand Canal themselves. Alarmed, they declared open conflict.
It's war. It's military strategy. And their language is all military language. We must defend our natural ramparts. That's a phrase used in the minute books, for instance. We mustn't allow them turn our position. You know, so here are military analogies all the time. And this derived in part from the influence of English thinking and the thinking of English railway directors on Ireland, because the Great Southern and the Midland Great Western both had English directors on the board.
Meanwhile, the Midland Great Western pushed on towards Athlone. The challenge was considerable: to lay miles of track across flat, marshy land and then construct a bridge across the Shannon.
This bridge was innovative in that he lay large cast iron piers, 1.5 inches thick, using what was a new method at the time, using compressed air to lay the piers on their bed. And these in turn supported the very large wrought iron girders, which are very pleasing to the eye and very strong and substantial and still there today, and were built to carry double-track railway line from the east to the west. The contractors were from Limerick, Fox and Henderson, and the girders, which are wrought iron, were constructed in Glasgow and brought to Ireland and assembled in Athlone, put into place using very primitive methods at the time, but incorporated a swing bridge which allowed navigation to sail up and down the river. The requirements for tall ships to sail through Athlone are not there today, so that span is fixed. But the bridge, which is white and known locally as the White Bridge, is very pleasing to the eye and indeed a landmark in Athlone or for people who are travelling to the west.
Having arrived at Athlone ahead of its rival, the Midland Great Western was well positioned to win the race to the west coast. Perversely, it was the government which had to force it to do it.
They were adamant, in fact, that they would not build to Galway until they thought there was sufficient traffic to justify it, which could be a generation ahead. So they got their act with the intention, in a sense, of not building to Galway. The famine continued on in the west of Ireland longer than in the east, and Connaught was still devastated by famine in 1848 and 1849. And government, which was lackadaisical in many ways in coping with the famine, nevertheless was sufficiently impressed by the horrors of the West and by the pressures put on them to say, we must do something. What can we do? Well, here is this Railway Act in existence, but the company's doing nothing about it. Building a line from Athlone to Galway will give employment, and please God, it will help develop the economy to some extent. Now, we accept their argument that it will not be profit-making in the short term. So that allows us offer them a subsidy or a loan. So we'll give them a $500,000 loan. Now, $500,000 in those days was about 25 million today. You multiply about 1 in 50 or 50 to 1, roughly. So it was a quite substantial loan. The Midland still didn't want to build, even with that loan. They were so, if you like, pessimistic about the traffic prospects from beyond the Shannon that they still said this does not make commercial sense. Until government said to them, well, if you don't build, we've a chap here called Stephen French who's dead eager to build, and we will revive his project. So the Midland accepted the loan to build to Galway from Athlone in a way almost under protest and as a defensive measure to prevent government supporting the original Fitzstephen French project. So that's how Galway got its line in the early 1850s as a result of all this manoeuvring by a variety of interested parties.
On August the 31st, 1851, the first Midland Great Western train went from Dublin via Athlone to Galway. Despite its former reluctance, the Midland was now flushed with success and set about taking the battle for passengers into the camp of its opponent, the Great Southern.
During that period in the 1850s and up to 1860, the war between the companies was a very live one. The Midland Company put steamers on the Shannon for a while to try to undercut the Great Southern route to Killarney, for example. They offered the passengers a rail trip to Athlone, a boat trip to Limerick, and then a coach trip to Killarney, which undercut the railway company's fare, but took an awful lot longer.
An ad appeared in the paper where the Midland Great Western offered to take passengers from Broadstone to Athlone, which would take about 4 hours, and then take them by boat to Killaloo, and arriving in Killaloo, they'd have to take a bus, earthbound bus to Limerick, an overall journey of 11 hours. And the price at the time was very, very competitive. It was something like 12 and 6pence first class and 6 shillings third class. And while the Southern would give a direct service from King's Bridge Station, as it was known then, to Limerick for something like 29 and 6pence first class and a 6-hour journey. Well, there was no great tourism, I'm sure, in those days as we know it now, and people weren't too well off. There was no Celtic tiger knocking around then. I think it was off necessity, and I suppose it was a question of economics or money. That if you could do the job and you had time in 11 hours for 12 and 6pence, why pay 29 and 6pence? And there was about 5 hours in the difference overall. But for people, I suppose it was an easy age. And people were relaxed, and I suppose they weren't watching the clock the way we watch it now. So I suppose leaving Dublin in the morning at 7:45 and having a trip on a train to Athlone and a cruise down the river through Lough Derg and to Killaloo. And then it was novel to have a coach and horse draw you and take you to Limerick. And I suppose 11 hours, and I suppose you had some refreshments on the boat and weren't too tired.
Throughout the 1850s, the two great rivals continued to jostle for advantage, with the result that the Great Southern did, in the end, gain parliamentary permission to build from Tullamore to Athlone. But though the Midland and the Southern now converged on Athlone, they couldn't agree to use the same station.
The Southern arrived in Athlone and they were a separate entity altogether. So much so that they set up shop on the Leicester side of the town, where they had their own sheds and they had their own turntable and their water supply and their own station. And by 1927, they closed that station altogether. And surprise, surprise, by 1984, they closed the fine Midland Great Western Station and they opened the Great Southern Station. Today, it has been refurbished out of a face and it's a fine station.
In time, the West was to be fully ironed by the railways, with all but the most remote areas having access. In time, too, some of these routes were depleted or abandoned, as a century later, the next tidal wave of emigration of the 1950s reduced the population yet again. From the perspective of a new millennium, what then is the overall legacy of the Midland Great Western Railway to the west of Ireland?
It improved what I might call the quality of life in its military territory, shall we say. It brought in those aspects of the modern world, much greater idea of speed, much wider distribution of consumer goods, enhanced export prospects for the cattle industry in particular. But it didn't make anything like the impact, or the railways in Ireland in general didn't make anything like the impact they might have done if the rest of the economy had developed in parallel. In a way, the railways were they were the most advanced technological sector at the time. And in that sense, Ireland was at the cutting edge of technological change. But because the number of obstacles to Irish economic development in general and to industrialisation in particular, including political obstacles, including the fact that British economic policy was not devised with Irish interests in mind, because of that, the railways, I think, were not in a way enabled to make the full potential contribution they might have, and this would apply to the Midland Great Western as much as to any other one, the full potential contribution, had there been a policy of economic development in a way parallel with the development of the railways.
Since that day in 1851, when the first Midland Great Western train left Dublin for Athlone and Galway, the entire country was to become ironed by the railway. By the end of the 19th century, the most remote areas had access. The railway was an integral part of everyday life, and Ireland had been permanently transformed. But the new times were to be very different from the old. Most of the railway companies became incorporated in the Great Southern and Western. And their story in the 20th century was to be as turbulent as the history of Ireland itself.
Train on a journey, train on a track. Take me where I want to go, take me back. Building the line by the sweat of your brow and the strength of your own hand. With stone, steel and sand, ironing the land. Railway sleeper, get no rest. Ride the iron horse into the west. With a pick and a shovel to the mountain pass. The boys of the Barrow gang. With stone, steel and sand, ironing the land.
If you would like to learn more about the history and relevance of the train system in Ireland, or indeed recapture the magic of this series, the book Ironing the Land is available from bookshops nationwide.